Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this webinar, Mindful Education, the Science of Attention in Learning Design. My name is Yaki Dayan and I'll be your host for this afternoon. We prepared for you an amazing program. We have a two-part program. We'll start by discussing the science of human attention and how can we actually measure this for the purpose of SEL and personal learning programs. We have a very educated panel on that. We have Dr. Sam Goldstein, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Attention Disorders, among many other things. And he wrote about so many dozens of books that I'm always amazed about when I see this big list of books that he has created so far. And we have Mickey Revenue, that she, among many other things, already in 2001 started to think about online education and online instruction. When we just started about thinking about bandwidth and being connected online to the internet. So let me start speaking a little bit about the science of human attention. We at Neurotech, we specialize in understanding human attention for over a decade. Our tool is a continuous performance test that is detecting attention disorders and attention difficulties for over a decade. We have done over 850,000 assessments to date in about 30 different countries around the world. This is a specialty that we have at Neurotech, but when I joined Neurotech about a year and a half ago, I was more intrigued about the potential of taking this into the education domain. Because if we look at child's personal development, whatever we do in education, we take a child from A to B, the same can be done for many of the skills and the characteristics of attention that are building his character and are building his learning style. Attention is essential to learning, but I would argue that, like the weather, many are speaking about that, not necessarily everyone understands how it's working. This is my son about 20 years ago when we were living in the Netherlands, and he went to American school over there. And one of the teachers complained that he's not paying attention. And, we were sitting in front of the teacher and she said, "Your child is not learning. He's not paying enough attention. He doesn't look at me when I explain. He doesn't take any notes. He doesn't even have a notebook." So my son looked at her and understood what to do. Immediately after that, when we came to the next meeting, she said, "Now he's perfect." Why? Because every 5 minutes or so, he would now make eye contact with the teacher. He was writing a lot of notes in a notebook that had nothing to do with the lesson that he was participating at. But for the teacher, everything was okay. Now she saw all the things that she understood means that he is learning. Now, I must say that as a parent, I also fell into this trap, because when he was learning computer science at university, he used to learn with music. And I would say, how can you learn with it? Shut the music and concentrate and learn better. But he's one of those guys that music is the thing that makes him learn and not the other way around. The diversity in attention is so big. So one of the challenges we had at Neurotech is that when we were doing all those assessments, we were measured by our ability to go to the target, to look at the child and understand if this child has attention disorder or attention difficulties with very high accuracy of over 90%. We didn't care about all the rest. So we were only focused on the, let's say, weaknesses, or maybe the disorder, or maybe the problems of the learner that are related to attention. When we need to go into the education domain, we cannot limit ourselves. just to look at this one specific case out of so many cases around them. So we need to look at the entire spectrum. We need to look at those that are having strengths and weaknesses, and there are so many different parameters that build the human attention that maybe you can excel on one of them and you do not excel on the others. One of the main challenges when we had to adopt to this school of thinking was that there was no frame of reference. So the first thing that we had to do at Neurotech was to create a baseline. What does it mean, a baseline? Think about it. Everyone today is talking about AI. Forget AI. This is pure HI, human intelligence. This is science and statistics and the intelligence of people that went through a lot of scrutiny and trial and error in order to build a database that is made of more than 60,000 assessments from our database. And based on that, we created a baseline for general population based on age and gender, meaning that for each child that we meet and we assess, we can place this child on a scale that is of other kids in his gender, in his age. And based on that, we can look at his percentile. The percentile is also something which is very key to the way that we measure today attention. Because now that we have more than about 14 different parameters, we would like to place the child or the learner on how he compares to his reference group in all those parameters, and based on that, build his profile. So when we are now providing these measurements to the school, to the teacher, to the educators, to the school counselors, etc., we are providing scientifically based data that is numerical, data that does not exist elsewhere. This is about 14 different parameters of the child's attention. One example is, let's say, self-regulation. This thing, self-regulation, is this elusive thing that actually makes personal learning happen. Because kids that have very low self-regulation cannot learn by themselves and need guidance, while learners that have very high self-regulation can excel in self-learning and self-guided learning. We created a very simple facilitation procedure for that, and we have an API. And our slogan is 15-minute scientific peek into the brain. We are providing the data, and we give the educators, the social workers, the school counselors, and all the others to do their magic based on this data. And this is our contribution to this science of learning. With having this in mind, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sam Goldstein. He's the chairman of our advisory board for years, and have done, I think, over his few years, something like more than 2,000 Moxot tests. Unbelievable number, Sam. Amazing.
Well, so, we have a large clinic, and every child takes the test because it measures 4 critical abilities, as you point out, that are necessary not just for acquiring knowledge, but for managing that knowledge and solving problems in everyday life. So as I listened to Yaki, an interesting analogy came to mind. And I think, Yaki, if I'm remembering correctly, I have 8 minutes. So I'm starting my timer and I'll keep track of my 8 minutes. But think about a computer. A computer contains knowledge in the form of programs, information that can do things for you. But for that information to take hold, to work in the real world, one requires an operating system. And in a sense, what Yaki is discussing is what neuropsychologists like myself look at every day, the operating system of the brain, the abilities that a child or an adult brings to a learning situation, to a social situation, to any activity or interaction in everyday life. And we use those abilities to then manage that knowledge to solve problems in everyday life, which is in fact what intelligence is all about. Intelligence is not about how much you know, but how efficiently and how effectively you manage that knowledge. So what Yaki is speaking to is not just an appreciation of, oh, we have a brain and that brain can learn, but an appreciation of the specific abilities that we bring into play to acquire knowledge and then to manage and demonstrate that knowledge. And in this brief talk, I'm focusing on social emotional learning. And in fact, social emotional learning is a body of knowledge that we want children to acquire, to more effectively manage not just their emotions, but their interactions with others. Social emotional learning is associated with sound mental health, perhaps. And we now appreciate that it's not something that children will acquire in an incidental way. We always thought that it was reading, writing, and arithmetic that we needed to focus on in school. And these other capacities, learning to deal with the world and others, was something that we acquire simply by osmosis. We simply acquire it by doing. And now we know that that's one way to do it, but a more efficient way to do it is to teach it and to provide children with opportunities to demonstrate it. And SEL has become almost a buzzword. And sometimes when that happens, words like resilience and intelligence and SEL sort of lose their meaning. So there's just a quick overview. I think we're talking about the acquisition of certain patterns of behavior and ways of thinking about oneself and interacting with others that lead to cooperation, that lead to demonstration of knowledge, that lead to good mental health. There's my look at, so what is social emotional learning? I think if you get a group of social emotional experts, SEL experts in a room, if you have 10 of them, you're going to get 10 different opinions. I am not an expert in SEL, but just as a foundation, I think it goes from the inside out. It goes from being self-aware of how your behavior affects others and how their behavior affects you, developing a set of strategies to manage yourself, both on your own and interaction with others, developing a set of strategies to facilitate relationships, and finally, to make good decisions. And so this is not just my list. I took the opportunity of asking ChatGPT to tell me the 7 or 8 critical abilities or skills that might be needed for SEL. And it came up with things like emotional intelligence, understanding your emotions and others, being mindful of how you impact others and how they impact you, being able to listen, resolve conflict, think critically, adapt, collaborate, work in a team. All of these are essential, but keep in mind that all of these require an operating system, that all of these reflect acquired knowledge, how to do things. But if you don't have an operating system, if you know what to do, but have a difficult time doing what you know, then all that knowledge does little good. What I'm going to argue, and I would have argued this long before I met Yaki or his predecessor, or long before I knew what Moxo did, because I've been involved in CPT assessments with Keith Connors from the very first 1.9, which was long before computers. It was a wheel that would turn and people would push a button when they saw the 9 followed by the 1. And we've come a very long way historically. Here are the 4 critical things I think the brain does that drive this operating system that lets us apply knowledge, whether it's academic knowledge as in reading or math or history or science, or whether it's knowledge of how to socialize or to solve problems. These for me are 4 key components, very consistent with Luria's view of planning, attention, sequencing, and simultaneous or critical thinking. These 4, I think, are maybe not the only components, but key components. The ability, it's not paying attention as in, quote, ADHD. It's paying attention to relevant details, knowing what to pay attention to, when. Children with autism have a difficult time. They pay attention to irrelevant details in social situations. It's timing, or what I refer to as speed of processing, being able to work your way through the material at a pace consistent with its exposure and with what's expected for you. It's impulse control, being able to stop and think, to open a window between experience and response, and use the knowledge you possess to respond in an effective or efficient way. And finally, hyperreactivity. I like that term. Some people have a difficult time with that term. For me, if you're looking for a synonym, for me, it's managing frustration. That children who can manage frustration as they struggle on a task or feel emotion in an interaction, as they manage that, it's more likely that the outcome will be better. So attention, timing or processing speed, impulse control, and handling frustration, or in the Moxo measure, hyperreactivity. I think these are the foundation, and I think you can possess all of the knowledge you'd like. You could possess all kinds of knowledge, but there's a gap between what we know and how efficiently we do what we know. And as clinicians, as neuropsychologists, our role is to measure that gap and to try and understand the variables that contribute to that gap, the size of those variables, and then to try and intervene. And what I can tell you is that these four variables, attention, timely responding or processing speed, impulse control, and hyperreactivity, are the foundation upon which children will apply the SEL knowledge they acquire in these programs we expose them to. Those four components will be essential in explaining how well or how poorly they then implement what they know in the real world. So yes, I'm a fan of Moxo. Do you need the technology to answer questions about a child's attention or processing speed or impulse control or frustration tolerance? No. We clinicians do it every day in our assessment. I evaluate a few hundred children per year here at the clinic, and our clinic evaluates 800 or 900 kids a year in total. I can sit with a child and I can measure, to some extent, based on my clinical experience, I can offer some observations. What does a test like the Moxo provide? As Yaki pointed out, it provides a sound, reasoned, and reasonable statistical analysis that tells you, not just in a qualitative way, but in a quantitative way, where this child is in these four critical components. And I think before we ever begin teaching, we need to know those so that we don't create unrealistic expectations for children. If you put your phone up against that little QR code there, it'll take you to my website. There's all kinds of resources, webinars, other PowerPoints, etc. And there's my social media. So thank you, Yaki.
It's a pleasure to be here. As I learn so much every time I hear you speak and hear Sam speak. So I'm just taking millions of notes and getting really excited about what all of this means for education, for classrooms, both traditional and virtual, and how this fits into this overall framework of how we're trying to teach differently now, especially pre and post pandemic, and how this kind of data that we've been talking about fits into that mix. As Yaki mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Connections Academy. So I've been thinking about different ways of teaching and learning for a really long time now. And what occurs to me is that, what's been true of the 21st century in education, and this is inside the US, but also around the world, because I think the trends that we're seeing in American schools and American thinking about education are starting to pick up in other places as well. And I think one of these is just the importance of data in general. Really, probably since No Child Left Behind days, if people don't have too much PTSD thinking about that. The idea that there's a set of data around students that can be updated regularly, that can be added to, and that will help us understand that student's profile as a learner is something I think that every educator at least aspires to wrap their arms around, even if they don't necessarily either have the data or the skill set to make perfect use of that. But this idea that data is important, that it's not just all instinct and art in teaching and learning, but that there's numbers and scales that really matter, has been a critical piece of what's made education different in this century than I think in the previous one. And then beyond academics, what I mean there is really everything that Sam just talked about. Social emotional learning as both an understanding of where a student is in terms of their mastery of those skills that Sam talked about, and as a topic of intentional instruction in and of itself. I think all of us recognize that kids having sort of a firm foundation under them from a social and emotional point of view is a really critical precondition to their ability to do academic work, and that we fool ourselves if we think that we can just focus on math and reading and not really understand where the student is coming from in terms of their ability to be present and the ability to flourish in whatever education setting they might find themselves in. And what those two things add up together, if you go back to the prior slide just for 1 second. So I often talk about the holy grail in education being personalized learning, by which I don't necessarily mean individualized learning or self-directed learning, although that's a really important set of strategies for this. But the idea that education can be tailored to the individual student, and that in order to do that, we actually need to have information about where they are academically and where they are from an SEL point of view. And I would argue that we have not, as a sector, really paid close enough attention to attention in all of this. We've been looking at academic data, we've been looking at other kinds of SEL data, but we overlook sometimes something that we just know instinctively, which is the critical importance that attention plays in learning. So without attention, we can't take in new information. Without attention, we can't turn that information into knowledge that we can then act on. As much as Yaki-san's teacher was looking for surface signs that he was paying attention, the idea that the student needs to pay attention and that's a really critical piece, I think is something that we've overlooked in American education, partly because we haven't necessarily had the tools to know more, to do anything about it in any kind of great detail. So I are going to argue that the pandemic threw us all into a tailspin on all of the dimensions of learning and drawing on this towards personalization that we were all building up to 2020. The pandemic itself, I would argue, has kind of left students, teachers, parents, all of us with a certain amount of collective trauma that really is the result of our routines and habits being interrupted for a decently lengthy period of time. In some cases, multiple years of schools either being closed or interrupted. And we know that one of the impacts of trauma is reduced attention. It really interrupts someone's ability to focus and concentrate. And so I think we need, as educators, to pay attention to that. Regardless of how you feel about the diagnosed learning gaps, whether you see them as opportunities for acceleration or gaps that need to be remediated, I think we all basically agree that the years of the pandemic left all of our students, but in particular our most vulnerable ones, with some ground to make up in terms of their learning. And how we approach that, I'm going to argue in a minute, really needs to be much more subtle and nuanced than we've done in the past. Because part of what also comes out of the pandemic is some emerging insights about, for example, the use of technology to help tailor learning and education for individual students. The challenges that the use of technology can also add to learning situations in terms of students' ability to focus on the right things and focus on them for a sustained period of time. But if we look at all these things put together, I think we're in a place of real opportunity to get past some blind spots that we've had about attention and do better for all of our kids. So I think that we as a society and as educators have to use absolutely every single tool at our disposal to heal and make up for lost time that we lost to the pandemic. I would argue that every strategy that we have to accelerate students' learning and to expedite their healing, to get young people to the place where they're flourishing in school again, whatever that school might look like, all of those things become much more effective when we can start paying attention to attention. So what does it mean to harness the power of attention in our classrooms? I would say, first of all, that as we look at that baseline and where all of us line up against it, the four different factors that pay into attention, we're no longer looking at a world where there's normal and some outliers. Certainly there are students that will be diagnosed with ADHD, which, as we know, can be both a deficit of attention and hyperfocus, or some combination of both. But I think we can see that all of us fall across that spectrum somewhere. And for certain topics and certain learning environments, we are stronger than in others. So once we make that assumption that all of us come with baggage, all of our kids come with some different abilities when it comes to their attention, it gives teachers the opportunity to read the room. I am imagining a situation in which a regular classroom teacher has an attention profile on all the students sitting in front of her, and can easily see when she needs to move things around, switch things up, do things differently in order to maximize attention for each of those learners, and recognizing that one size does not fit all. It's not a matter of shouting louder or forcing everyone to have eyes on them in order to get attention, but really being adaptable and creating a mesh of different environments within any learning situation that brings out the very best in every learner. That's a challenge, absolutely no question about it. I think all of us know that dealing with all of this data, even if you have really great dashboards, putting all those things together and knowing what to do with them is one of the huge challenges of teaching and learning in the 21st century. But I think it creates a huge opportunity to do even better than we might have done before. So what I'm proposing is a move towards what I just made up the term, attention-informed education, sort of like trauma-informed education or other education that's informed by other factors beyond just the reading, writing, and arithmetic. How do we create learning environments where attention is something that we're paying close attention to? And I think the first place that we need to look is at the design of our content and curriculum. As someone who's worked most deeply in online learning, that curriculum design is absolutely crucial. And yet we don't necessarily think about it from the point of view of the different and diverse learners that we have sitting in front of us. And we need to. We need to be able to adjust and adapt for students who are easily distracted and those who really want to go deeper into a particular topic. The physical classroom environment or the virtual classroom environment is something that we do have control over and can easily adjust to ensure that those who need help with some focus are sitting in a place in the classroom where they can do that, whether that's virtual or physical, and that students are working together across their different abilities so that they're bringing out the best in each other. Instructional strategies are, just like, how do you do what you're going to do? How often do you change modalities? How do you make sure that you're not boring the crap out of every learner, not just the ones who have a hard time paying attention, and really be able to draw deeply on the well of expertise that students have about their own ability to learn. And the corollary of data-armed teachers, I believe, are self-aware students. And so I'm imagining a future in which each learner is very aware of their own profile when it comes to attention, and therefore knows what it is that they need and can advocate for themselves to get that in any given learning situation in K through 12, in post-secondary education, and also in the workplace, where if we buy everything that we're being told, lifelong learning is not just a nice to have, it's a must have. And so all of us need to be aware of how we learn best, what gets in our way, and what we can do to adjust our learning environment. So I see great hope for getting past our blind spot, our collective blind spot around attention. And by focusing in and paying attention to attention, getting us all to a better place in terms of education.
Thank you very much, Mickey. And Sam, can you also join us into this conversation for a few more minutes? First, I would like to say that I'm blown away by this presentations. It's amazing, how we didn't practice a lot, but we complemented each other. I mean, it's amazing. And Sam, I would like to ask you, what is the key takeaway that you take from Mickey's presentation, and then the other way around?
I'm biting my fingernails, Sam.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't know that one can pick a single key takeaway. The overarching umbrella is that we need to go back and rethink what education is all about. I'm a bit of a cynic because in the United States, schools were started to keep children out of the workforce 200 years ago. They weren't necessarily started because we felt there was a need for organized education. And that not so illustrious beginning has led us to where we are. And we still teach the way we did 100 years ago. And we've introduced technology into the classroom, but we use it like we use a textbook. We don't really use it in a way that one would expect. What Mickey is arguing for is the same thing that I am. And that is we need to go back and rethink what is education all about? And is it just the acquisition of as much knowledge as you can stuff into a child's head? Or is it the acquisition of critical thinking abilities to use that knowledge? I'd rather have a child with less knowledge, but better application than the other way around. And so we're simply arguing that when kids come into kindergarten, and I'll leave it there, perhaps instead of asking them, do you know your colors and shapes and letters, we ought to line them all up and give them a cookie and ask them not to eat the cookie and see who can wait long enough. Because the kids who can wait long enough have enough impulse control to begin the educational process. And the kids who eat the cookie immediately don't have that impulse control. And for me, again, attention is this bigger umbrella. It's just so people understand, when I talked about those 4 critical skills, that all really falls under attending, right? Impulse control, handling frustration, processing speed, attending to detail, all falls under that broad umbrella of attention.
What do you say, Mickey?
It's interesting because I know from reading your work, Sam, that you also believe very strongly that each of those dimensions, students can learn and grow skills in them as well. So your
Yes.
kindergartner that eats the cookie right off the bat, their early learning needs to be, the academics need to be coupled or perhaps even overshadowed by the skills that they're going to need to be effective learners. I think we've all seen that young people pick these things up really quickly too, that it's not a linear, one thing has to happen and then another thing has to happen. And I've been really intrigued by what students are capable of if they're have the opportunity to focus on things that actually interest them, as opposed to things that adults think they ought to know. And so I'm kind of more optimistic that the combination of technology, this idea of personalization of learning based on data, and the idea that this is all fungible, that it's all a mindset that can be grown and developed, means that even students who are in wildly different places on your dimensions can thrive in any kind of education setting and learn the knowledge that they need to be effective citizens, to have a happy life, to support their families, basically.
And Yaki, one of the most exciting things about education today is that we're finally beyond the 100 years of telling everyone that intelligence is about how much you know and how well you can write it down or recite it. And in fact, intelligence, this is what's so exciting about education. We now realize that intelligence is about critical thinking, and critical thinking can be modeled, can be shaped, can be taught. I'm not suggesting we're going to make Einsteins out of everyone, but the data is very clear. You teach children how to think critically, their grades go up, their relationships go up, they deal better with everyday life. And I think what we're arguing in this presentation is that even using those critical skills is dependent upon your attention, your processing speed, your ability to handle your impulses, and the efficiency with which you handle frustration. And all of those can be taught, and all of those can be acquired. Again, some kids are going to go further than others, but we need to be more mindful to teach it to all children and not assume they just obtain it by osmosis.
Mickey, you started one of the taglines of your presentation was 21st century. Okay. Now there is this very interesting gentleman, Israeli, Sol Zinger, that is one of the authors of the book Israel Startup Nation, and I had the opportunity of having him as a speaker in all the 4 summits that I've done in Israel. And he has this argument that says 21st century skills is things that we needed to have also like 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The only thing that we call them now 21st century skills is now because the education system realized that we need to teach them and we don't know how to do that. Now, if you actually, and I'd like to, and another phrase that is very, very popular in Israel, that what you learn out of school, not you learn at school. Now, I would like to connect this to what you mentioned about the Holy Grail, about personalization, and there is no vacuum in life, okay? And kids are smart as hell, okay? So very often they can create their own strategies of learning. Now, it could be that the strategy that they decided to adopt for learning is not necessarily the right strategy, but it's working for them. But if it's not the right strategy, then it's creating for them a lot of cognitive load. They need to put a lot of effort in order to fit into the system.
Right.
And I think that one of the benefits when we unfold and we discover what are the attention profiles of a specific kid, we can direct him into, let's say, much more streamlined learning strategies that more that fit more his personal profile. And if we are doing just that, we are creating a change for life with this kid. And I'd like to maybe conclude this conversation by saying that you cannot be in education if you're not optimistic.
Yeah, because otherwise it's a path to
I mean,
despair and destruction.
So, Michael, what do you have to say about that? I mean, are you also optimistic when you think with education?
Absolutely. And I have a question.
Sure.
Prior to the pandemic, diagnosing learning disorders in school was very challenging. I think the statistic was 1 counselor at the school per 700 students, right? You bring into the pandemic and that has gotten worse, right? So I've always asked myself as I'm out talking to schools, virtual, private, charter, international schools as well, there's a tremendous interest in something like Moksho. Including today, we've got several pilots in the making. But my question is when is the MAS going to adopt a technology that is going to allow us to diagnose students properly instead of putting them into an IEP, which then leads them down a course of nowhere? And I say that because I had a middle school student who went into high school, was diagnosed with a learning disability, thrown into an IEP, and he was there for about 2 to 3 years. And I finally got a little frustrated and said, I need to understand this. I had to take him outside of the education institution to a clinic at the expense of $1,800 to find out that he didn't have ADHD, he was dyslexic, which there was a tool online for, and within the course of 12 months, he was back on par at reading level. But that didn't happen without my involvement at the expense of $1,800 outside of the education environment. So roll forward, we have now a brilliant technology. When is the MAS going to adopt something like this where we can now address these students, diagnose them properly, and have the prescription left to the school who has a number of tools to use?
Well, I'd love to jump in on this, but I'm not the expert. I'll let Sam finish. But
let me just be a little
go for it.
controversial, Michael. When are we going to abandon a diagnostic pathological
That's interesting.
system
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
rates people one way or the other. You know,
Yep.
as a neuropsychologist, I'm interested in your strengths more so than your weaknesses,
I
because it's
agree.
your assets that get you where you go when you transition into adult life. So I'd like us to abandon this whole system. If you understand the history of diagnoses, they were created to decide how to best help someone.
Mm-hmm.
But now they've been co-opted by third-party payers, by institutions,
Yep.
as a way of supposedly identifying not the reason for your problem, that's what you're complaining about, but your eligibility to receive some kind of services that may or may not fit the need
Mm-hmm.
of the problem. What we're arguing for, and I think we're all saying the same thing, is a better way of understanding, as Yaki likes to say, your brain. And when you think about Moxo, we're not using it because you could think of it in a pathological way. You could say, well, the child's low on attention, so we have to teach
Right.
him to pay attention. Or the child's high on impulsivity, we need to teach him how to not be impulsive. Here, we're just suggesting better understanding the pattern of how the brain is developing and providing educational experiences that fit that.
Mhm.
And this is a big promise for AI. If you look at AI-based reading programs, Mickey's probably more familiar, like MindPlay, they do just that. They try and find the child's patterns and track the child's progress. And I would argue we don't treat the diagnosis anyway. So what do we really need it for? What we need is an identification of strengths and weaknesses and a path to help the child acquire the knowledge they need to go and the critical thinking skills to go out
Mhm.
into the world.
And I think
I-
there's a huge, if I could just jump in there, I think there's a huge sort of professional development / confidence building that needs to
Mhm.
happen for just regular classroom teachers and educators, because for so long this stuff has been in the domain of the special education director and maybe the school counselor, but not necessarily in the hands of the day-to-day educator, because of this like medical model, right? Looking at at diagnosing huge problems that somebody else needs to solve. So to keep going down this path means that teachers need some additional skills for
Mhm.
understanding what to do with this data, and also the confidence to believe that they're not going to hurt a kid by taking this data and doing something with it. And that's I think the big leap, honestly.
Teachers
I'd like
spend
to,
teachers spend a lot of their educational time being taught how to teach.
Mhm.
They spend very little of their time trying to understand how people learn. And we have this Stepford wife kind of a matrix view that every child is the same, every brain is the same, and every child with a diagnosis is the same. Keep in mind, these diagnoses are like Chinese restaurant menus, 2 from column A, 2 from column B. And the reading disorder diagnosis is based on a discrepancy of where you are from where someone thinks you should be for your age or for your grade. And maybe you're there because you've just had lousy teaching and it hasn't fit how you learn best, or it hasn't. We need to get down to the why and not be so hell-bent on measuring the what, if that makes sense.
I'd like to, we need to also to be mindful of the time. So
Yeah.
I'd like to wrap this conversation maybe by something that, very inspired me, Sam, when when I read your book and we had a conversation about it, tenacity in children. eh, that over there you kind of self-reflected upon yourself. You said you became like a sophisticated test machine.
Hmm.
Give me 30 seconds. I look at the person. I immediately know his flaws. Okay, and then you wrote in that book, and I remember this very clearly, that it takes a lot of patience to move away from this habit and to try to look at the entire spectrum of the person, strengths and weaknesses, and not jump into conclusion. And I think that this is where we are trying to be. We don't want someone to misuse any tool just to categorize someone and say, okay, he's problematic, take him out to school. I don't want to use it. I don't want to have him on the class, etc. And the ability to look at each student and understand the student better is something that is I think the holy grail of education, and this is where we expect teachers to have the empathy and the professionalism in order to look at the child more than just another a future worker of the society. So, Michael, I think that this is maybe the cue to hand over the reins to you.
Thank you,
and
sir.
over to the panel.
I appreciate it. Everyone, thank you so much. That was a brilliant conversation. My takeaway from that was I think everyone on the panel or in the webinar had the same belief. Pre-pandemic was challenging, post-pandemic even more challenging. So I appreciate that, everyone. My name is Michael Spencer from Global Spanish Strategies. I will be moderating a panel today of distinguished panelists coming from various walks of education. And so by ways of introduction, I'd like to introduce you to the